And in the 1990s, the Clinton era, the period of the most dramatic expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But the drug war has been waged almost exclusively there, resulting in millions of our young people being shuttled from their decrepit, underfunded schools to high-tech new prisons and then ushered into a permanent undercast for engaging in precisely the same kind of criminal activity that is ignored on the other side of town. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court, where has it been in all of this? The U.S. Supreme Court has largely turned a blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. The court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that in the absence of evidence of conscious intentional bias, effectively an admission of racial bias, you can't even state a claim for race discrimination in the criminal justice system. They're asking for the very evidence that is nearly impossible to come by in the so-called era of color blindness when, everyone knows better than to say, yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was because he was black. Yes, Your Honor, the reason I didn't give him that plea deal, well, it's because he was black. But unless you have that kind of evidence of conscious, intentional, deliberate bias, you can't even get in the courthouse door to state a claim of race discrimination in the criminal justice system. In this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has immunized the criminal justice system from judicial scrutiny for racial bias. It has rallied to defend this new system in the same way that it once rallied to defend Jim Crow and slavery in their days. Now, I recognize time's running a little bit short, but I want to identify just a few of the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow and then say something about what we're going to do about this. Ask yourself whether some of these rules and laws applying to people labeled felons remind you of a bygone era. Well, first, denial of the right to vote. 48 states and the District of Columbia deny prisoners the right to vote. Now, in the United States, people just shrug at that. But in most European democracies, prisoners vote. In fact, there are voting drives in prison. Voting drives in prison. Those countries take democracy a little more seriously than we do. Because here in the United States, not only do we deny the right to vote to people in prison, but once they're released, they can be denied the right to vote on probation or parole. Depending on what state you live in, you can be denied the right to vote for a period of years or the rest of your life. Nationwide, about 1 in 8 African American men have been temporarily or permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws. And if you think that's not much, well, Al Gore would have been president if felons had had the right to vote in Florida. Studies have been showing how many races nationwide would have come out the other way if people labeled felons had had the right to vote. Exclusion from jury service, perfectly legal. If you're branded a felon, you are deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life. All white juries have been having a roaring comeback in many parts of the country, including those that are fairly racially diverse. Why? Because not only are felons deemed ineligible for jury service, but if you've ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, you struck from a jury for cause. Now, good luck finding many African Americans, particularly in poor communities, who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that could justify their exclusion from a jury for cause. So wholesale exclusion from juries and all-white juries have had a roaring comeback in the era of mass incarceration. Employment discrimination, perfectly legal and absolutely routine. Virtually every application has got that box you got to check. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Doesn't matter if that felony happened 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box. I am a felon, knowing full well that the odds are sky high that application's going straight to the trash. In fact, one study showed that about 70% of employers wouldn't even think about hiring a drug felon. And it gets worse for people who are convicted of more serious crimes. Many states also deny professional licenses to people convicted of felonies. In some states, you can't even get a license to be a barber or a manicurist if you've been convicted of a felony. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal. Not only can private landlords discriminate against you, and nearly all do if you have a criminal record, but you are barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years when you're released from prison, and your family risks eviction if they allow you to come home and stay with them. What are folks expected to do? Discrimination is perfectly legal in public benefits. As I mentioned before, you are under federal law deemed ineligible even for food stamps for the rest of your life. You can be convicted of a drug felony. Fortunately, some states have opted out of this federal food ban, but it's still the case that most people convicted of drug felonies are ineligible for food stamps for the rest of their life. Pregnant women, people with HIV and AIDS, doesn't matter how sick you are, how poor you are, how hungry you are, not even food stamps for you because you were once caught with drugs. So what do we expect folks to do? Can't get a job, barred from housing. You may not even be able to get food stamps. What do we expect folks to do? Well, what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, and in a growing number of states, the cost of your imprisonment. And then get this. If you're one of the lucky few who actually managed to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What do we expect folks to do? I say, what is the system designed to do? Seems designed to send people right back to prison, which is what in fact happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. But many people released from prison tell me that's not even the worst of it. That's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is the stigma and shame that follows you for the rest of your life. That stigma of, I'm a felon. It's not just the denial of the job, but that look that flashes across an employer's face when he sees that job, that box has been checked. It's that shame of when, a neighbor says, who you gonna vote for? And not wanting to say, I can't vote. It's that shame and stigma that causes so many people to try to pass. During the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks would try to pass as white to avoid the shame and stigma associated with race. Well, today, many people labeled felons or criminals try to pass, not just by lying to employers and to housing officials, but by lying to their friends, neighbors, coworkers, even relatives about their own criminal history or that of their loved ones. There was a fascinating study done in Washington, D.C., an ethnographic study. It was eventually published as a book called Doing Time on the Outside. It was a study of neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., hardest hit by mass incarceration. These are neighborhoods where literally every house or every other house or apartment has a family member who's either currently in prison or has just been released. Neighborhoods where you would think incarceration and imprisonment is just so normal that everybody talking about it all the time. They were unable to find a single person in these neighborhoods who had fully come out to all their friends, neighbors, loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their family members. The shame was such that people would say, oh, my uncle, yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure where my uncle is, he's out of town. Haven't seen him in a while, nope, don't know when he's coming back. Children would say, my daddy? Don't know where my daddy is. The shame and stigma was so severe that an eerie silence about mass incarceration has fallen over even the community's hardest hit. And this silence makes collective political action next to impossible. So where do we go from here? What's to be done? Well, I spend the last chapter of my book exploring that question in some depth, but I think one thing is clear, is that those of us in the civil rights community, we've allowed a human rights nightmare to occur on our watch. You know, well, many of us have been out there fighting for affirmative action, trying to hold on to the gains of the past. Millions of people have been rounded up, swept into the system, branded felons, ushered into a permanent second-class status with barely a peep of resistance from the civil rights community and African American leadership in the United States. So what do? Nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in the United States. Now, why do I say that? Like I mentioned before, if we're to just go back to the bad old days of the 1970s, we have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison. 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, already teetering on the edge of economic collapse. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies, now listed on the New York Stock Exchange, they'd have to watch their earnings vanish. Prison guard unions are now among the largest and most powerful political organizations in many states. They don't just lobby for higher pay, they lobby for 3 strikes laws, harsh mandatory minimum sentences because they guarantee job security. Those folks have to be willing to walk off the job. This system is not going down without a fight. It's not going down without a fight. And we have our work cut out for us. We need to end harsh mandatory minimum sentences, cut off the funding that give these financial incentives to law enforcement to boost dramatically the numbers of arrests in poor communities of color, and these drug forfeiture laws that allow law enforcement to seize people's cars and cash, keep for their own use that money to fund their drug enforcement efforts. We've got to end all forms of legal discrimination against people branded felons. We have a lot of work to do. But we can't do this work piecemeal. We'll do this little reform project over here and one little over there. No, this system will rebound well. And if there is some success in downsizing this system, what will happen? Do you think prison guard unions and private prison companies are going to say, you know what? We need to keep millions of people in prison so that other people can have jobs and make a good return on their private investments? No, that's not what they'll say. They'll pay politicians to say, get tough on those people. No free passes. No getting out of jail.